The British Empire once spanned a quarter of the world's land and population, with the sun famously never setting on its territories. But after World War II, a war in which Britain stood as a key Allied victor, the empire entered a period of rapid economic challenge and transformation. Many know the story of military heroism and alliance with the United States through programs like Lend-Lease, but fewer explore the long-term financial dynamics that emerged from wartime aid. How did massive support from America during the war connect to Britain's post-war economic difficulties? What role did loans, debt repayments, and changing global finance play in the empire's transition? This isn't about hidden conspiracies, but about documented historical cause and effect, dollars, debts, and shifting economic power. We'll trace the timeline step by step, from pre-war strengths to post-war adjustments, using facts from archives and economists. By the end, you'll see patterns that echo in today's world. Stay with us as we explore this important chapter in history. To set the context, let's go back to the interwar years. The British Empire was an economic network connecting Britain with colonies and dominions through trade, resources, and the sterling currency system. Colonies supplied raw materials, while Britain provided manufactured goods. The pound sterling served as a global reserve currency in many areas. However, World War I had already strained Britain's finances significantly. The UK borrowed heavily from the US, accumulating debts that lasted decades. The Great Depression in the 1930s led to abandoning the gold standard in 1931 and creating protected trade preferences within the empire at the 1932 Ottawa Conference. This helped stabilize the system but highlighted growing vulnerabilities. Key figures included Winston Churchill, who as chancellor had managed currency policies, and economists like John Maynard Keynes, who advised on financial matters. In the U.S., President Franklin D. Roosevelt and officials like Cordell Hull focused on expanding American trade and reducing global barriers. As World War II approached, these pre-existing financial pressures would interact with new wartime realities. The story accelerates in 1939 with Britain's declaration of war on Germany following the invasion of Poland. Military spending rose dramatically, and Britain needed vast supplies, especially from American industry, as the U.S. remained neutral initially under cash and carry policies. The fall of France in 1940 left Britain defending alone. Gold and dollar reserves declined rapidly as assets were sold to pay for imports. Churchill communicated urgently with Roosevelt about the need for continued support. This led to evolving aid mechanisms that would shape the future. Section: Rise of Wartime Support. In 1941, the Lend-Lease Act allowed the U.S. to supply materials to allies, with payment terms deferred. Britain received the largest share, billions in equipment, food, and resources that proved vital to the war effort. The program was presented as mutual benefit, supporting allies to defeat common threats. However, agreements included commitments to post-war trade discussions and reducing certain barriers. As the U.S. entered the war after Pearl Harbor, cooperation deepened. The 1944 Bretton Woods Conference established new international institutions and positioned the dollar prominently in global finance, reflecting America's growing economic strength. Military spending skyrocketed from $626 million in 1938 to $3.5 billion by 1940, over half the national budget. Britain's initial strategy relied on its empire for resources, but it needed modern weapons, aircraft, tanks, munitions that only the industrial giant across the Atlantic could provide. The U.S., bound by neutrality acts passed in the 1930s, insisted on cash and carry. Allies could buy American goods, but only with cash and their own ships. Cause: this policy protected U.S. isolationism. Effect: Britain had to liquidate even more assets. By late 1940, the UK had sold off $335 million in gold and securities to American buyers, often at fire sale prices. Gold reserves plummeted from $2.8 billion in 1938 to $1.7 billion by 1940. The fall of France in June 1940 was the first major breaking point in this early phase. Cause: France's collapse left Britain standing alone against the Axis. Effect: the Battle of Britain ensued, with the RAF desperately needing American planes. Churchill pleaded with Roosevelt, "Give us the tools and we will finish the job." But tools cost money and Britain's dollar reserves were evaporating. By December 1940, Churchill wrote to FDR in a now famous letter, warning that without aid, Britain might not hold out. He described the empire's financial straits but hinted at resilience. Yet the subtext was clear: help or lose your buffer against Hitler. This desperation set the stage for the rise of American involvement. But here's where the mystery deepens. What if the U.S. aid that followed wasn't the salvation it appeared to be? What hidden mechanisms ensured that every shipload of supplies came with an invisible invoice? We'll uncover that next as the story escalates from cash-strapped survival to debt-fueled dependence. As 1941 dawned, Britain's plight intensified, marking the rise of U.S. dominance in the alliance. Cause: the Blitz ravaged British cities, straining resources further. Effect: Roosevelt, sensing public opinion shifting toward intervention, pushed for creative solutions. First came the Destroyers for Bases deal in September 1940. The U.S. transferred 50 outdated destroyers to Britain in exchange for 99-year leases on British bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. On the surface, a win-win, but it symbolized Britain's eroding sovereignty, trading imperial territory for survival. Then, the game-changer, the Lend-Lease Act, signed on March 11, 1941. Roosevelt pitched it masterfully in a fireside chat. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire and I have a length of garden hose. I don't say to him, "Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it." I don't want 15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. Cause: this analogy sold the program to Americans wary of entanglement. Effect: over the war, the U.S. provided $50.1 billion in aid, about $690 billion today, with Britain receiving the lion's share, $31.4 billion in supplies, from jeeps to Spam. But delayed answer alert. Was it really a lend with no strings? Not quite. The act stipulated that recipients couldn't re-export Lend-Lease goods without U.S. permission, preventing competition with American exports. More crucially, payment was deferred until after the war, but not forgiven. Article 7 of the Lend-Lease agreements required Britain to commit to post-war economic reforms, including reducing trade barriers aimed squarely at dismantling imperial preference. Hull, the anti-imperialist, saw this as a way to open colonial markets to U.S. goods. Cause: Britain's dire need forced acceptance. Effect: aid flowed. Over 38,000 tanks, 165,000 aircraft, billions of tons of food, but at the cost of future economic independence. As the war progressed, this dependence grew. Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the U.S. fully into the fray, but Lend-Lease continued as the backbone. Britain coordinated its economy with America's, importing raw materials and exporting manpower, sending troops to North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Yet whispers of resentment emerged. American officials like Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau grumbled about Britain's imperial hangovers. Keynes, advising the British Treasury, warned internally that Lend-Lease was creating a dollar overhang, Britain accumulating sterling debts to its colonies while owing dollars to the U.S. By 1944, as D-Day loomed, the rise peaked. Bretton Woods Conference that July established the post-war financial order, the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed by gold, with the IMF and World Bank under American influence. Cause: Britain's weakened position meant it couldn't dictate terms. Effect: sterling's role diminished, foreshadowing the empire's financial eclipse. But the real hammer blow was coming. What happened when the war ended abruptly? How did victory turn into economic defeat? The breaking point awaits. August 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan's surrender, ending World War II. Jubilation swept the globe, but for Britain, it was the breaking point. Cause: President Harry Truman, succeeding FDR in April, abruptly terminated Lend-Lease on August 21, 1945, just days after VJ Day. Effect: Britain faced a financial Dunkirk, as Keynes termed it. Overnight, the pipeline of free supplies dried up, leaving the UK with $20 billion in external debts, depleted gold reserves of just $1.9 billion, and a war-ravaged economy. Why so sudden? Truman cited congressional pressure and the Act's wartime mandate. But critics argue it was deliberate, to force Britain into negotiations on American terms. Churchill's government had fallen in July 1945, replaced by Clement Attlee's Labour Party, which prioritized domestic reconstruction. Britain needed $5 to $6 billion to bridge the gap, but the U.S. offered far less. Keynes led the delegation to Washington in September 1945, expecting a grant or interest-free loan. Instead, after grueling talks, the Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed on July 15, 1946. $3.75 billion at 2% interest, plus $650 million to settle Lend-Lease debts, repayable over 50 years starting in 1951, with deferral options. The secret bill revealed the loan's conditions were the killer. Britain had to ratify Bretton Woods, make sterling fully convertible to dollars by July 1947, and eliminate discriminatory trade practices. Cause? These clauses aim to dismantle the sterling area and open the empire to U.S. commerce. Effect? Immediate strain. Britain's economy, already burdened by rationing and reconstruction, faced a dollar shortage. When convertibility kicked in on July 15, 1947, a run on the pound ensued. Foreign holders converted sterling to scarce dollars, draining reserves from $4 billion to $2.4 billion in weeks. The government suspended convertibility after just 5 weeks, but the damage was done. This breaking point exposed the empire's fragility. India, promised independence during the war to secure loyalty, gained freedom in August 1947 amid partition chaos. Cause, economic weakness meant Britain couldn't suppress nationalist movements. Effect, loss of the subcontinent's resources accelerated decolonization elsewhere. Palestine in 1948, Malaya's emergency, Africa's wind of change. The fallout from this financial maneuver was swift and devastating. Cause, the loan's repayments began amid Britain's 1947 winter fuel crisis and 1949 devaluation of the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Effect, gold and dollar reserves hit rock bottom, forcing austerity measures. By 1950, Britain owed $13 billion externally, with the empire costing more to maintain than it yielded. Defense spending alone ate 7 to 10% of GDP. Decolonization snowballed. In Africa, Ghana's independence in 1957 set a precedent. By the 1960s, most colonies were free. Cause, the U.S. actively encouraged this, tying Marshall Plan aid, another $2.7 billion to Britain from 1948 to 1952, to anti-colonial policies. Effect, loss of cheap raw materials exacerbated the dollar gap. Britain exporting to sterling areas but needing dollars for U.S. imports. The Suez Crisis of 1956 epitomized the fallout. Britain invaded Egypt to seize the canal, but U.S. financial pressure, threatening to sell sterling bonds, forces withdrawal. Cause, Eisenhower's opposition. Effect, humiliation, signaling the end of independent British power. Economically, the empire's dissolution meant a shift to Europe, joining the EEC in 1973 after U.S. nudges. The loan's final payment came on December 29, 2006, $83 million, closing a 60-year chapter. But the true cost? The British Empire, once indomitable, reduced to a mid-sized power, its global influence ceded to the American century. Attempts to fix this unraveling were numerous but futile. Cause, Britain's post-war leaders recognized the trap. Effect, Keynes fought for better loan terms, arguing in Washington that interest would cripple recovery. He wanted a grant, settling for the loan only after threats of no aid at all. Attlee's government deferred payments 7 times, 1956, 1957, 1964, 1965, 1968, 1969, 1976, under the agreement's hardship clause, but interest accrued, ballooning the debt. Other fixes floundered. The 1949 devaluation aimed to boost exports but fueled inflation. Harold Macmillan's Wind of Change speech in 1960 acknowledged decolonization as inevitable, but economic aid to former colonies strained budgets further. Even the Marshall Plan, while helpful, came with strings promoting European integration over imperial ties. Cause: U.S. strategic goals. Effect: Britain couldn't rebuild the sterling bloc. By the 1970s, oil shocks and IMF bailouts in 1976 underscored its diminished status. These failed efforts highlight the inexorable cause and effect. Aid bred dependence, dependence bred debt, debt bred decline. But does this story echo today? Fast forward to today, and the parallels are shocking. Just as Britain borrowed from a rising America post-WWII, the U.S. now holds over $35 trillion in national debt, 130% of GDP, as of 2025. Cause: decades of deficits, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan costing $8 trillion. Effect: vulnerability to creditors like China, which holds $800 billion in U.S. treasuries. Shocking data. In 1945, Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio hit 240%. America's is approaching 130%, with interest payments alone projected at $1 trillion annually by 2026. Repeating patterns. Economic superpowers overextend militarily, then face secret bills from allies turned rivals. Think U.S.-China trade wars, echoes of imperial preference versus U.S. open-door policies, or NATO allies pressuring America for defense spending, much like Lend-Lease reversed. Could China demand concessions, forcing U.S. retrenchment? History whispers yes. Empires don't fall to swords alone, but to spreadsheets. So, what are the three clear takeaways from how the U.S. bankrupted the British Empire? First, alliances come at a cost. Even in victory, aid can be a double-edged sword, turning friends into debtors. Second, economic weapons are subtler and deadlier than military ones. The secret bill of WWII wasn't tanks. It was terms that reshaped global power. Third, empires crumble financially from within. Britain held vast territories but couldn't afford them post-debt. Vigilance against overextension is key. A warning: as America's debt mounts, will we heed this lesson or repeat Britain's fate? The patterns are there. Will history rhyme again? If this video opened your eyes to the hidden side of history, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten stories, and comment below. Do you think the U.S. is on a similar path? Let's discuss. Thanks for watching. Stay curious.